In this video, I'm going to showcase every single tank matchup currently in Overwatch 2 and give some quick tips on the best and worst matchups for each tank. Since tank fights are now 1v1 and you maintain a high percentage of your ultimate charge when switching, swapping to another tank to counter the opponent has never been more important. Let's start with Doomfist. In the top left of your screen, you can see Doomfist's good matchups in green and his bad matchups in red. The enlarged matchups are the strongest on each side and thus the ones we're going to be discussing. His best matchup, in my opinion, is against Winston. Whilst both heroes look to dive each other's backlines, Doomfist is generally more effective going in alone and requires less of his team's resources. This allows the Doomfist to dive effectively by himself and cause a threat to the enemy backline, whilst his teammates can now deal with the isolated Winston. Conversely, his worst matchup comes against Orisa, who is able to stay with her team and protect them from his dive. Orisa is able to keep tabs on the Doomfist, using her cooldowns to counter the plays that the Doomfist tries to make. She can fortify if the Doom tries to punch, and she can javelin if the Doom tries to block. Doom is now not able to isolate targets, and definitely cannot fight the Orisa, so he becomes pretty useless in this matchup. DVa's best matchup is actually also Winston. DVa is the ultimate peel tank, meaning should the Winston try to dive her backline, she's able to disrupt and put the Winston in trouble. Since Winston has a relatively large hitbox, DVa is able to hit most of her pellets into Winston despite her shotgun spread. She has higher mobility than Winston, having a more controllable movement ability on a shorter cooldown. The combination of her damage paired with her mobility makes her matchup against Winston super favourable. Her worst matchup comes against Zarya. This explanation is pretty simple. Zarya is always able to beam through DVa's matrix and farm her for damage. Should DVa try to dive Zarya's teammates, Bubble works super effectively to save her teammate and farm some energy. She can also charge energy by using bubbles against DVa's self-destruct, making her relatively effective at countering DVa's ultimate as well. Of course, DVa can eat Zarya's Graviton Surge, but overall this matchup is super favourable for Zarya. Moving on to Jungle Queen now, her favourite matchup is also Winston. He's not having a great time at the start of this list. Jungle Queen's primary fire is also a shotgun mechanic, which works super well against Winston's large hitbox. Should the Winston player try to dive the Jungle Queen's team, she has two counters to prevent this. The first is the fact that her team will usually be playing close to her, so she can easily turn around and disrupt the Winston. Secondly, her commanding shout ability adds 50 health to her teammates, increasing Winston's time to kill on 200 HP heroes by an entire 25%. Overall, she just has too much damage and utility for Winston to play into her. Her worst matchup, however, comes against Orisa, who has insane survivability up close. Orisa can use her abilities to effectively kidnap the Jungle Queen, and since his abilities are on a shorter cooldown in comparison to Jungle Queen, she almost always has them available to counter any Jungle Queen engagements. Orisa also doesn't care about Jungle Queen's ultimate, as she's able to fortify up and survive through it, making her relatively stable when fighting the Queen. Speaking of Orisa, let's talk about her matchups next. Her best one is most definitely against Reinhardt. Similarly to Jungle Queen, Orisa is able to kidnap the Rein and almost entirely nullify him. As long as you're shooting and utilizing your cooldowns, the Rein player pretty much isn't able to play the game. Orisa's worst matchup comes to Reinhardt's old friend in Zarya. Zarya is pretty much always dependent on her bubble charge being high, but should she have energy, then her DPS up close can truly melt Orisa. One way she's able to charge this against Orisa is by bubbling against her ultimate, taking no damage in the process and popping an entire bubble for it. You just have to nail the timing on this one. Orisa doesn't really have any defense against Zarya's beam attack, as she can deal damage directly through Orisa's javelin spin, making her a great counter to Orisa. Let's talk a little bit about Ramattra's matchups next. Since he's still relatively new, his matchups are still kind of undefined. In my opinion, his best matchup is actually against Sigma, since Ram has two different ways of closing down Sigma's poking space. He can close space on Sigma by using his 1000 HP shield, or by using his Nemesis form's passive speed boost. Sigma has no real counterplay to Ramattra in either form, making it a super good matchup for Ram. Ram's worst matchup, however, is against Roadhog. Ramattra's two forms are designed to help him control positioning, and Hog really ruins that with his hook ability. He can hook Ram out of position, and Ram doesn't really have a way of threatening Hog back. On top of his frail attacks, Ram also cannot protect his team from Hog running off onto the flank and hooking them. In Omnic form, Ram is squishy and susceptible to Roadhog attacks in general, and in Nemesis form, his block cannot stop Roadhog's hook, and he also struggles from the Winston problem of having a super large hitbox that Roadhog's shotgun can spam into. Next up is Reinhardt, whose best matchup comes against Zarya. Rein is the damage king at close range fighting, even against Zarya. Utilizing his shield and health pool, Rein generally has a lot more sustain than Zarya does, allowing him to stay in the fight for longer at closer ranges. On top of this, his shield is just a generally good counter to Zarya's ultimate, being able to protect teammates who got stuck in grav, or even being able to block the grav from traveling behind him. Rein's worst matchup is actually against one of Zarya's best, Orisa. Orisa's ability to kidnap Rein and completely nullify him with her abilities gives Rein almost no counterplay. Being able to block pins, fire strikes, and even shatters with her abilities makes her the ultimate Reinhardt counter. Roadhog is the ultimate counter to any tank with a large hitbox. However, his absolute best tank matchup is against a Winston. Hog is able to completely stop Winston's dives and general positioning by using his hook. Once hooked in, Winston stands almost no chance against the largest shotgun in the game. Additionally, Hog's ultimate is the absolute best way to shred Winston, giving the monkey absolutely no chance in this matchup. So, which tank beats out Hog? Once again, Orisa. Orisa doesn't really care about getting hooked in, as she has stupidly high survivability up close and will usually have some teammates around her. Orisa's cooldowns are generally effective counters to Hog's cooldowns. Her Fortify is able to block hook, and her Javelin is able to counter breather. All Orisa really has to do is stay close to her team and always be alert of the Hog's position, and she can shut him down pretty easily. Up next is Sigma, whose best matchup is also Hog actually. Sigma also has super effective cooldowns against Hog. His shield is able to block hooks, and his rock is able to stop breather. Sigma's suck is also a great get out of jail free card should he get hooked in. Just watch out for getting this baited before getting hooked though. Sigma is generally happy to sit back and poke out Hog's teammates, to which Hog doesn't offer any protection against. Sigma's worst matchup comes against Ramattra in my opinion, as Ramattra has some great space taking tools against Sigma, and Sigma has next to no counterplay to Ramattra getting up in his face and punching him out. Our next tank is Winston, who also has a very good time against the previously mentioned Sigma. Sigma's general playstyle is to stay at range and poke his opponents out. However, Winston's jump is a great way to mitigate that space and get up in the Sigma's face. Sigma has no defense against Winston's zap, meaning he's in trouble when this space is closed down. Winston's worst matchup is the one we just discussed against Roadhog. Being hooked out of position and out of dive attacks is really disruptive to Winston's playstyle. Hog does a ton of damage once Winston is in his face, and again this is fully showcased in the interaction of Whole Hog. Onto another dive tank now, let's discuss Wrecking Ball. Ball's best matchup in my opinion is against Reinhardt. Rein will typically ignore the ball, which allows the ball player to distract Reinhardt's backline. Since Reinhardt is a tank that requires a lot of resources from his team, the Rein player will now become isolated and struggle in this matchup. Comparatively, Wrecking Ball does not require resources from his team and has great mobility and self-sustain to be a constant distraction. This allows the Wrecking Ball's team to deal with the Reinhardt, then push forward to deal with the Reinhardt's remaining teammates. Since Wrecking Ball prefers this dive style of play, his natural best counter is the same as Winston's, Roadhog. Once again, Hog is able to disrupt Ball's dives and positioning, and even counter Ball's grapple and pile drive cooldowns with his hook. Ball is also a tank with a large hitbox, meaning Roadhog's shotgun is incredibly effective at close range after pulling him in. And finally, let's talk about Zarya. She has a ton of good matchups against other tanks, but is admittedly a little bit weak in the meta right now. Her strongest matchup comes against DVa, as she's able to rip through her matrix and deal constant damage. Her bubbles offer great utility against DVa's dive mechanic and against the ultimate as well. Zarya's worst matchup comes against Reinhardt in my opinion, as he is the ultimate damage king up close. Zarya simply doesn't have the sustain that Rein does, and often loses this close range brawl to Rein. In my opinion, Zarya actually has the best tank matchups overall, even if she isn't actually that strong right now. She has 6 tanks that she beats in matchup, and only 2 tanks that she's weak against. Conversely, I think Winston might actually have the worst tank matchups in Overwatch 2. In my eyes, there are currently 5 tanks that do a good job in countering Winston, and only 2 that he counters himself. I'm gonna leave a link to an image post in the description of this video that can kind of act as a matchup cheat sheet. Remember, these matchups are based solely on the concept of how the tank functions, assuming that they're all viable and of equal power, so it should apply to future seasons as well. But of course, also remember that these are just the opinions of one guy, so be sure to drop a comment down below about which matchup you disagree with the most. Apart from that, feel free to drop a subscription to the channel as well if you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you in Nepal.